Hello and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just not in the way that you might be expecting. I'm Clayton Becker.
And I'm Megan Cox.
And welcome again to this very first episode of the podcast. I think for those who aren't familiar, we ought to give a little bit more of an explanation as to what this show is since our first go at it. What do you think, Megan?
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. People might be new, people might not have caught our trailer. Catch our trailer.
So basically, this is a show where we talk about the more progressive, more egalitarian things that we used to do and the ways that we used to do things.
And especially discuss how those more egalitarian, more progressive ways have been dismantled by the baby boomers or older Gen Xers.
Yeah, we want to talk about the ways that we used to do things that were very effective and how we just haven't kept doing them that way. Mm-hmm. And so for our first episode, as the good little political scientists that we are, we're going to be rejecting purity tests and embracing big tent politics. At the outset here, though, I think it's important to clarify what we're not talking about. We're not talking about certain things when we talk about big tent politics. We aren't talking about making common cause with and driving towards the policy goals of racists, sexists, xenophobes, and more. What we are talking about, though, is recognizing that the American public and the public of various states here in the United States just aren't particularly progressive, right? The Pew Research Center, for example, puts the percentage of the electorate that can be considered stalwart progressives at about 9%.
This is completely divorced from what you might believe if you spent all of your time on Twitter.
Yeah, if you spend all of your time on the internet and you inhabit progressive spaces, you come to the conclusion that like progressive policy and progressive candidates are really, really popular. And that's just not the case at the aggregate level. Like, the populace of the United States is quite conservative. And despite that, making change requires getting elected. And you can't get elected on just 9% of the electorate.
You could try.
You can try. You certainly can try.
Probably not going to work, though.
The Green Party tries every year,
every 4 years?
Every 4 years, and they never succeed, right? Mm-hmm. And so basically, what we're trying to say here is you can't get elected if you're not willing to consider the views of more moderate voters. We see this on the Republican side, right? Particularly starkly.
Oh, yeah.
Given just how conservative much of the American electorate actually is, and the kind of like structural advantages that they have. I mean, Megan, you know this as a comparativist,
yes,
right?
Yes.
This is, I guess, a little digression we should take here. I am an Americanist. I mostly study the United States, and I mostly study state and local politics. Megan is a comparativist.
Which means that I study other countries in addition to the United States.
Yes, and you primarily study, comparative legislative institutions. Do I have that right?
That is correct, yes. That is my particular, very specific species of nerd right there.
All right, anyway, good. So that digression aside, Megan, as a comparativist, you'll understand this terminology. The Republican Party has sort of lucked into genuinely hybrid regime level structural advantages here. Mm-hmm. Do you want to take us through exactly what that means a little bit?
Yeah, just really quickly, the concept of a hybrid regime or an illiberal democracy, you'll find in countries where you look at it and you say, that's not quite a free and fair election. It just doesn't seem like opponents have a fair shot of displacing the regime, but you're still having democratic elections, the minority is still winning some seats in the legislature, etc. And the institutional advantages that the Republican Party has at this point, because of the structure of our bicameral legislature and Congress and the Senate having equally apportioned seats, you see that the Republican Party manages to hold on to many more seats in a equally apportioned legislative body than they otherwise probably would in a legislative body that was apportioned more appropriately given the population of the U.S. And in addition to that, you've got the House of Representatives capped at 435.
Yeah.
So realistically, you would want the population of California to be equal to 55 Wyoming's worth of people if you wanted an equally proportioned House, and California has 55 seats.
But it's not.
It's
I think
not.
California,
65.
yeah,
California should have 65.
Yeah.
California is 65 times the population of Wyoming. All of that is to say, a long, long digression with Megan, all of that is to say that Republicans hold an incredible advantage relative to their actual popularity in the country.
And so they should just be totally running the table, right? Like, it should be easy for them to have majorities in Congress every single time.
And yet
they aren't, because they can't stop being a bunch of weird freaks who are hopelessly to the right of the public on lots of different issues and who have crazy purity tests on their own side of the party.
They have driven Dick Cheney and Alberto Gonzalez out of their party.
For those who are younger than Megan, another little digression here. I'm 26. Megan is 35?
36.
36. For those who are younger, those who are my age, a decade younger than Megan.
These guys were the enemy-in-chief of Democrats for 8 years.
Alberto Gonzalez in particular, I think people won't know about. He's a
deep cut.
It's the equivalent of like Ben Carson or like Rick Perry endorsing AOC in like 2034 or something.
Rick Perry's a good one. Or I would say Greg Abbott, someone like that.
Exactly. And so so the Republican Party should be running the table, right? But they're hopelessly to the right of the public on a bunch of different issues: abortion rights, tax cuts for the wealthy, climate change and environmental protection, and a few more, right? Like their constant bending of the knee to the NRA, the Club for Growth, the Heritage Foundation, and to Donald Trump himself, right? Like they're holding back the party from being as effective as the Republicans should be, given just how conservative the country is, which, thank God, right? Thank God. But on the other side, on the Democratic side, the side we want to do well,
we will air our preferences
here. We're not going to be at all shy about that. But if we look at history, right, the kinds of policies, the kinds of laws that get passed when one party has really significant majorities in the House and the Senate, they're qualitatively different from the kinds of policies that get passed when there is a bare majority or when government is divided, right? So again, a little bit of a political science digression here. There's this guy who, if you know a little about political science, you may have heard of, called David Mayhew. And Megan has his book. She's teaching. But so Mayhew's argument, one of Mayhew's argument in a separate book, not Congress here, but in a book called, what's the name of this book? Divided We Govern. There we go. It's called Divided We Govern. He has this argument that actually this isn't really true. The same number of significant policies are passed in both divided government and unified government. But if you actually dig into the policies that Mayhew uses here, he uses something called Sweep 1 and Sweep 2 laws, which are laws that were identified as being important pieces of legislation by journalists at the time, and those that were later determined to be significant by academics in retrospect. But if you look at the actual policies that are going on here, the ones that come under these huge majorities just are qualitatively different. You get things like the New Deal, the Great Society. You get things like Medicare and Medicaid.
Can we throw Obamacare in there?
Yeah, we can throw Obamacare in there. We needed huge unassailable majorities to get Obamacare passed, right? And now I'm realizing at this point that for those of you who are just listening to this as an audio medium, the book I held up for those who are watching this on our visual medium is Congress, the Electoral Connection by David Mayhew. I promise we'll get better at this as we are not in our very first episode. But the kinds of laws that get passed during smaller majorities are significant, right? They're things that journalists would mention, but they're things like foreign aid packages, the regulation of cable, deficit reduction packages, things that, yes, are significant laws and academics might consider them significant, but aren't the kinds of policy we actually want to get passed, right? They're not the kinds of things that Johnson passed in the Great Society, that FDR passed, or even that Biden passed, like with historically like aberration of how much he was able to get done, right? So, you know, just broadly speaking, when we talk about this kind of stuff, these very large majorities facilitate better legislative action. And I think we can look to other countries around the world too, more Megan's forte, to see how this operates in other parts of the world. Like Mexico's Morena party is also largely the kind of like big tent party of old. The current government of Brazil, including the new party formed for Lula's election in 2022, Brazil of Hope, is also a wide-ranging coalition of parties, including everyone from the literal Communist Party of Brazil all the way to the centrist Avante. It's very big tent, right?
We might throw the French kind of legislative coalition in that category as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Emmanuel Macron is being annoying and allying with the right-wing French, the centrist sort of Les Républicains instead of the left-wing alliance that won a larger percentage of seats. But that left-wing alliance in and of itself, right?
That's what it took to win that majority of seats.
Yeah. And like all of these things are like various strains of centrists and leftists coming together to defeat the far right. And that's more or less what we're arguing should happen here, right? And like, you know, there's often this argument that, oh, well, you can't like vote out the fascists, right? And you can't vote out the fascists, but you can stop them from being voted in, right? And for a very long time, throughout the entirety of the 20th century, basically, in the United States at least, or not the entirety, but like post Roosevelt's election in 1932, the Democrats have these unassailable majorities for decades, right? And it stops the United States from developing really any sort of fascist movement until we get to today, until we get to the 1990s, right? And as we have experienced more political polarization, we've seen the consequences of this polarization. We have gridlock, the rejection of compromise, the just inability of Congress really to get anything done. Like these, in our view at least, or somewhat in our view, are both the results of these kinds of purity tests, of refusing to run candidates that you know can win in areas where they have to be more moderate, they have to be more centrist in order to win. And I have a number of different examples that I've written down for myself here so that I wouldn't forget them, of places where you have examples of Democrats governing in conservative and moderate states and the need to meet voters where they are rather than just running progressives who are never going to win. Like, you move policy left by having progressives win in safe seats, not by losing swing seats to Republicans. So I'm going to run through a few of these examples here, and Megan, feel free to jump in with any examples you have, because a couple of these are going to come from places you know well.
Yeah.
Our first example from the state you went to college in is indeed. John Bell Edwards versus Jeff Landry, the current governor versus the former governor. John Bell Edwards is a Democrat, conservative Democrat, pro-life Democrat even, pro-life Democrat. Right? But during his governorship, he expanded Medicaid.
Yep.
And so
the actual pro-life position, if I may.
And so during his governorship, during Donald Trump's presidency actually, Louisiana was one of the only states in the entire country which actually saw a decrease in its uninsured rate. Almost every other state in the entire country, due to like federal retrenchment from Donald Trump's administration, saw increases in the rate of uninsured people. But Louisiana got more than 75,000 people onto Medicaid. That doesn't happen if you don't run a more conservative Democrat in Louisiana.
If you run a progressive Democrat in Louisiana, they lose to the Republican.
Yes, they lose to Jeff Landry, the current governor of Louisiana, who has passed statewide abortion bans following the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court in 2022. Another example here is Joe Manchin versus Shelley Moore Capito, both currently senators from West Virginia. Now, I'll be clear here. Joe Manchin bugs me, right?
Yep.
I find him aggravating.
You find him aggravating because he has power.
Yes. However, his value above replacement insane, right?
Huge.
To look at Shelley Moore Capito, right, who votes with Biden's position on things, who votes with Democrats' position on things, essentially none of the time, to Joe Manchin, who votes with their position 85% of the time, like, the difference really could not be starker, right? Things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, I think actually expansion of Medicaid in West Virginia, maybe, when Manchin was governor of West Virginia, right? None of these things happen without Joe Manchin's vote. And, like, honestly, the man can be, quite frankly, nearly as conservative as he likes, as long as he votes for most of the things the Democrats put forward in the Senate. Because if you can win as a Democrat in a Trump plus 60-some state, right? Like, Fine, right? Fine.
Do what you got to do.
Do what you got to do. Similar story. Sherrod Brown versus J.D. Vance, right? I don't think we really need to expound upon how Sherrod Brown, union guy, running for re-election this year in Ohio, is better than J.D. Vance, who has run with this absolutely totally false story about Haitian immigrants eating cats to the point where there are bomb threats in Springfield, Ohio, right?
That's the most recent thing. Hopefully by the time this podcast is aired, we will have moved on to whatever the next nonsense story is. But at the moment, J.D. Vance is not looking like the most temperate of dudes.
No. Other examples, Tony Evers versus Scott Walker in Wisconsin. Like, Tony Evers did a bunch of great stuff, right? That Scott Walker, like, totally beefed, right? Like repealing right to work laws, giving students free school meals, things like Steve Bullock versus Greg Gianforte, former senator from Montana versus, I don't think current senator, but current governor. Not senators, yes. For former governor versus current governor.
The problem here is that each of these two people
have both served in both positions.
Multiple positions.
Yes.
Also, because Montana only has the one representative.
Yes.
Everyone's running for statewide office.
But Steve Bullock did a lot of good things in Montana that Greg Gianforte has absolutely not done, right? And has tried to reverse in many instances. And then last but not least, in my little list of people here, we've got Andy Beshear, current governor of Kentucky, done a ton of great stuff.
Love him.
Lauded for his response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Kentucky, for his response to educational problems in Kentucky, versus the governor that he replaced, Matt Bevin, who was so bad that voters in Kentucky elected Andy Beshear, elected a Democrat, right?
Andy Beshear.
Yeah, and so I think, like, all of these examples just, like, go to show you that even if they're not perfect, and I don't think I consider any of these Democrats on this list perfect.
I don't know.
Right?
I like Andy Beshear.
I like Andy Beshear too. He's pretty good. He's got a pretty sterling record
Probably
for
closest
for a Democrat in
Closest
Kentucky.
on the
Absolutely, yeah. But regardless of that, the fundamental thing here is that they're so much better than what would replace them, right? And if we ran AOC in place of all of those different folks, not a chance in hell. Not a chance in hell that she would win. And so I think, we have to think about this as, like, the necessary strategy to get people in office where we have a shot of actually winning elections, right? Like I said up at the top. You move policy left by having progressives win safe seats, but not by losing swing seats to Republicans. With that, I think it's probably about time for us to take a little break, and we'll come back after the break and talk about what we actually do here. All right, and we are back. So when we left off, I said we were going to come back and we were going to say, what actually should we do here? What is this?
How do we solve this problem? And when I say how do we solve this problem, I'm not sure what direction you're going to take this, but I think the call is coming from inside the House. It is an issue for progressives to either resign themselves to the fact that they will keep losing, or resign themselves to the fact that they will need a candidate who doesn't tick 100% of their boxes.
Yeah, they might have to back the play occasionally. And I think I am probably a little bit more progressive than you are, Megan.
I think that's possible, yeah.
And so, like, I have had to do this in basically every election I have ever voted in, right? I have to back the play, right?
Yeah,
like, I fight in the primary, right, to get the candidate that I want to win.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then at a certain point, I recognize, like, okay, the primary process is over. I got to back the play here, right? Like, I have to vote for the person who will not be a fascist in office.
I would have loved Elizabeth Warren to be president. I would love to have no student loans right now. However, Joe Biden was my guy.
Yeah, another piece of Megan lore for you guys out there is Megan is also an attorney.
Yeah.
She went to law school, so
Yep.
she's got way more student loans than I have.
Yeah, baby. Gotta
anyway.
be paying those till I'm dead.
Yeah, but at a more like technical level, right? Like short of just getting rid of our completely insane electoral system, which would sort of avoid this need to back the play in certain districts or whatever, and would make it so that like big tent parties aren't even really like necessary, so to speak.
Yep.
We ought to move to something like ranked choice voting, right? Like obviously I think both of us would prefer something like proportional representation, mixed member proportionality.
I have conflicted feelings on that. I think it moves the point of conflict into the legislative chamber rather than in the election, but
This is fine. We'll talk.
We talk about that.
We'll talk about that. But I think that like ranked choice voting is one of those things that
Yeah, I agree.
allows people to like vote with their heart rather than with their head, without the like problems of, you know, like electoral spoiling effect.
Yes.
Right? Like one of the problems that like precludes true big tent parties in politics is that like under our current system is like you only get one choice.
Yep.
Right? And it's
One shot, one opportunity.
Would you capture it? Again, for you young people out there.
Oh, God.
That's an Eminem song from his movie 8 Mile. You only get one choice, and it's really, really hard to run a campaign that speaks to like real solutions, which at least I deem mostly to be very progressive in nature, without alienating swing voters, right? Really hard to run a campaign without alienating moderates. And simultaneously, as we're seeing right now, right, the opposite, the reverse is also true. Like Biden has passed some really progressive policy, like genuinely, I think, some of the most progressive policy of any president since Johnson. But the more conservative policies that he has pursued are really wrecking him with more progressive demographics, right? And I think that we are sort of one mind here. We haven't discussed this as such, but
Doing it
that
live.
like ranked choice voting is not as important as its most ardent advocates make it out to be, but simultaneously it's like way better than like bog standard first past the post.
Yes.
Right? Like
Yes.
which is the system we have right now. Like single member constituencies, one person, one
Most
vote,
votes.
like
Yep.
most votes wins, right? It removes the spoiler effect, right? Ranked choice voting does. Allows people to express their views more, like actually faithfully, but allows politicians to campaign a little less strategically. Allows them to actually sort of say what they want to say, rather than being like, oh, I have to target everything that I want to say at swing voters in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Right? As we are recording this, it's the late in the week after the first presidential debate. And so every time Kamala Harris said something about fracking, I was like, this answer is why the Electoral College is dumb. Why first past the post is dumb. Or, I mean, even if we really wanted to like just go all in on just getting rid of the Electoral College, right? Like getting rid of our entire electoral system.
Just straight popular vote.
We'd still be embracing a more big tent style of politics because of the way that coalition governments work. And this is what you wanted to talk about, what we're going to get into.
Yeah.
Like, right now, the way that our political parties work, the way I view the two main political parties, is they're just very long coalitions, right? And they're coalitions that are formed before the election as opposed to after it, right? Now, I think that there is instrumental value to coalitions being formed post-election because you actually sort of know, you know, what the relative strength of each member in the coalition actually is, for example. But they're still coalitions nonetheless.
Yes.
And so, Megan, maybe we'll let you jump in here a little bit more fully as our comparativist.
As the resident comparativist.
Yeah, and to talk about how this relates to rejecting purity tests, embracing big tent politics,
absolutely.
and how it might work in an American context.
Absolutely. So when we talk about purity tests, what I think we need to take a minute and really think about what that means in both parties or in any party. The idea that you must support every policy and a package of policies that a party is putting forward in order to be that party's candidate. Now, you heard us talk about John Bel Edwards, who is a pro-choice Democrat.
Pro-life Democrat.
Pro-life Democrat. He is an unusual character because being pro-choice is typically the position of Democrats. It used to be a fairly common occurrence to have fluidity on social issues being things like abortion, gay marriage, etc., and be in either party. You could be a pro-gay marriage, pro-choice Republican. You could be a Democrat who was not super comfortable with either of those things. And over the last 20, 30 years, I'm going to say my existence in politics. Honestly, I came into politics quite young, and I'm older than the average.
Another piece of Megan lore is that she almost flattened John Bon Jovi at a John Kerry rally in 2004.
I can't believe you remember that story.
I remember everything, Megan. You're not getting away from me.
Yeah. So my first race was, the first race I worked was 2004. I was 16. But I come from a family that was always very, very involved in politics. My mom worked for Bob Packwood in 1980.
No idea who that person is.
So Republican, this is the perfect tie-in. A Republican who was fiscally conservative but socially very liberal. And he was the sort of person that just would not exist in the Republican Party today.
Yeah, the kind of person who I don't think I could name the closest person I could think of, maybe like Lisa Murkowski.
Yeah,
maybe Susan Collins.
Susan Collins, Olympia Snowe, who is no longer a senator but was for a long time from Maine. Those sorts of individuals, they really don't.
And even then, like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins aren't like that socially progressive.
No,
they're just pro-choice Republican women.
Yes, the threshold for being a progressive Republican is
the bar is low
in hell.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna need some help bringing this in for a landing here, I think. But we have these long lists of policies where candidates or elected officials must match every preference of their party. Whereas if we had a proportional representation system, we wouldn't feel this need to sort into two parties to compete in the same way. We would be able to fracture into a bunch of parties, allowing for variation in those lists. You would have a party of socially liberal, fiscally conservative centrists. You might even come up with the reverse.
You'd have people who are these like stalwart progressives who like form a more like left-wing workers party or something, and that party would get 5 to 10% of the vote.
The Working Families Party would get
like on the East Coast in New York and Delaware, right? Like they would get seats in the legislature, right? And like the way that coalition governments work is just either one party has won enough seats, even in the proportional system, to have a majority, or multiple different parties work together to form a coalition government, right?
That constitutes a majority in the legislature and gets their preferences passed.
And this is the most common form of government on most of the European continent.
Yes.
Places like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, like all of these countries have...
Most of the Nordics.
Yeah, like Germany, right, which has my personal favorite system, mixed member proportional, just because I can't get away from the geographic representation. You're getting into the really nerdy part of the podcast, by the way,
we're going to start talking about New Zealand in a second. It's going to get...
Yeah. But anyway, the long story short here is that coalition politics, right, are by their very nature big tentified, right? Like you need to have different parties being able to agree to drive towards certain policy goals, even as each one of those parties has their own ideas about the way that things should be and what they're going to run on in the next election, right? Like nobody expects in even like the UK, where they do have a first past the post system, right? Just much smaller constituencies and like some other things, regional parties that make it a little less...
It's a little weird.
Little less prone to two parties. But nobody expects that like the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, right, are going to like run defense for Labour, right? Nobody expects that like the old UK Independence Party or the Reform Party are going to run defense for the Tories, right? But by the time that those parties get into the legislature, right, if they don't have a majority in the House of Commons, you need to form a coalition government, right? Same thing in France or in Belgium or the Netherlands or New Zealand, right? Parties need to agree to work together, right, in order to get things done.
And the key then in agreeing to work together is, as Mick Jagger says, you can't always get what you want.
Mick Jagger, for those of you who are young, is the lead singer of the Rolling...
Hang on. Who the hell doesn't know who Mick Jagger is? I will accept that with an Eminem reference, but the Rolling Stones...
I'm sorry. Okay, continue, Megan. Continue.
And here I was worried we'd have a hard time coming up with a running gag.
The running gag is Megan is older than Clayton is.
Yep. So when you are in either a coalition that forms after your elections, or in the case of a big tent party, a coalition that forms before your elections, you are conceding the fact that you are not going to get every single one of your policy preferences met. And so to have a functioning party that wins majorities in this country, what we are recommending to progressives, quite frankly, I say we as if we've discussed this before it comes out of my mouth, but we are recommending that progressives, to a certain extent, accept that they are not going to get unanimous support from all Democrats, or Democrats are not going to get elected. It's one of the two.
But as a trade-off, if Democrats are able to win large majorities in the House and the Senate and the presidency, it means you're going to get better policy, right? Like, if we think about what it'll take to implement something like a Medicare for all style system, if we think about what it'll take to, like, for my own sort of pet research interests, as those of you coming from TikTok will know, like, create a public housing developer or like do anything of like real significance with regard to housing, the Democrats are going to need to have substantial majorities in the House and the Senate, right? Like they're going to need to be able to lose a couple of votes, right, in order to actually get this done, right? And so sure, we might not like institute full socialism for those who are like that progressive out there, who have that as like their minimum requirement for a candidate in order to support them.
You're going to be disappointed for a long, long time.
You're going to be disappointed for a long time. But we are going to be able to more effectively get things like universal health care, like better environmental protection, more climate legislation, better social support, right? All of those kinds of things only happen if you can elect Democratic senators from places like Montana and Ohio and Kentucky and Florida, right? Like Georgia, Arizona, like places that are more conservative than the country as a whole, right? Or than the like liberal enclaves where we often live. I mean, we live in Los Angeles, right? Megan's about to move back to Portland, right? Perhaps an even more liberal enclave, right? Places like New York, Boston, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, wherever. Wherever most of like the hotbeds of progressive activity in this country are, like the kinds of candidates who can get elected there, like who should be elected there, quite frankly, the progressive candidates, the AOCs, the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, right? The Bernie Sanders of the world. They are not going to get elected in places that we need to elect Democrats in order to maintain a Democratic majority in the legislature to get anything done.
No matter how much we may agree with them, we being you and me, one of the best proofs of concept for a more socialist-leaning government is social programs that work. And you're not going to get that done all at once, all in one shot. I firmly believe that we were not going to get from the medical system that we had in 2006 to Obamacare in 2010 to anything better than that without that stopping point at Obamacare. Something that, again, I'm going to bring my age into it. Something that tends to kind of grind my gears as someone who's been working in Democratic politics for a long time is we have gotten to the point where the way the medical system worked prior to Obamacare is kind of falling out of living memory for younger progressives who are now the prime age political activist.
I made a video about this earlier this week on my TikTok. Yes, about how lots of people are simply too young or have memory hold just how bad things were before Obamacare, right?
Yeah. So as obnoxious as it is in many ways, and I am not happy with the state of healthcare and with my healthcare.
Neither am I. Just to make it clear.
Yeah, just to make it clear, Medicaid for all sounds great, but we needed that stop in the middle, and we wouldn't have gotten there without, quite frankly, Max Baucus, conservative Democrat from Montana.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
We don't get... I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think the revolution is imminent.
I also don't think the revolution is imminent. Those of you, again, coming from my internet presence will know that I frequently talk about how waiting for the revolution is not going to save us, right? It's not going to help anyone. I have said this phrase before a few times. In the absence of the ability to destroy capitalism, which we do not have, the intermediate step needs to be pushing towards feasible policy solutions right now.
Yes.
And those feasible policy solutions look like getting things like Medicaid and Medicare expansion through Congress. Things like the American Rescue Plan, like the Inflation Reduction Act, like child tax credits, making them permanent, right? All of these things do not happen if Democrats don't have majorities in Congress, in the Senate, if they don't have the White House. And you got to get elected, right? You got to get elected.
Clayton, what do you say to people who have a hard time seeing the difference between the two parties?
Yes, well, I could talk about that for a long time.
Okay.
So let's take another little break. And then when we come back, I can go through my argument on that point.
Okay.
All right. All right, welcome back, everyone. All right, when we left, Megan had asked me about one of my pet topics.
Oh, yes.
Which is, what do I say to people who have trouble seeing the difference between the two political parties? And, like, frankly, if you're, like, a certain kind of person, like, if you're, like, a full-on communist, like, you're not going to be satisfied with my answer here. But I think that for other progressives, people who, like, maybe just are quite young, don't have like super defined ideologies, but like look at sort of the things that happen or things that are happening right now and are like, well, these things are happening under a Democratic president, right? I think that the biggest argument here is just like look at what Democrats do at the state level when they have majorities, when they control the government, right? And I think the best
trifecta is what we're talking about.
When they control both chambers of a state house, unless you're Nebraska, don't talk to us, Nebraska.
You do Nebraska?
Yeah, and you control the governorship, right? So looking at what Democrats actually do, right, when they have control of state governments, right? And I think the best example of this is our vice presidential nominee's home state, Minnesota, under Governor Tim Walz, with a 1-seat majority. They have enacted a wide-ranging progressive program. Things like free school meals, right? Things like massive changes to housing policy. Things that, like, quite frankly, you know, even a state as like proud of its history as Minnesota is, right? Like, just hadn't been done in a long time, right? Or look at sort of the distinctions between places like California and Florida, right? California in 2022 voted in a legislature-sponsored amendment to the California Constitution guaranteeing the right to an abortion, right? Democratic-led state house, state assembly, and state senate and governor, right? And then voted on by the state's public. Meanwhile, the government in Florida, controlled trifecta by the Republicans, did precisely the opposite, right? And are now voting on a ballot measure to
is a ban,
a 6-week abortion ban, right? And like you can look at a bunch of other states on this, right? Like every single state that has protected access to abortion through legislative means or that has expanded access to abortion since the Dobbs decision is run by Democrats. And every single state that has done the opposite is run by Republicans, right? like it just really isn't that difficult. Like if you look at the policies that Democrats enact when they are in power, like when they have the ability to do things, they are different from the things that Republicans do when they also control state houses, when they control the legislature.
We could call this a harm reduction strategy.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what you need, right? If you're that kind of persuasion, then that's what you should look at this as, right? Like, I know that people don't like being told to vote for the lesser of two evils, right? And I don't think it's that way at all, right? Like, if you actually look at the policy programs that get enacted, right? Like right to work laws being repealed in Michigan, right? By the Democratic trifecta that they have there, right? The kinds of like policies that they've instituted in places like Washington around the environment and climate change, right? Compared to the policies that they have in places like Texas or Oklahoma, right? Or, you know, just really any other sort of conservative state that has like resource extraction, right? It's really clear. It's night and day, right? And so if you need to think of it as harm reduction, go ahead and think of it as harm reduction, right? That's fine. I'm not going to stop you. If that's what helps you, then I'm all for it, right? But I just don't think it needs to be viewed that way. Right? If you think about the states that have expanded Medicaid, right? All of the states that haven't expanded Medicaid today are the ones that have been consistently governed by Republicans since the Medicaid expansion went into effect. And there are multiple states right now. I think Kansas, North Carolina, and maybe also Kentucky. Unclear whether Kentucky is there, but I know that Kansas and North Carolina are, where Republican state legislatures are stymieing the Democratic governor's attempts to expand Medicaid to more people, right? There are hundreds of thousands of people in those three states who would be eligible for Medicaid under the free Medicaid expansion. Like the federal government is giving free money. Wants to give free money to states to expand their Medicaid programs. And these states just don't want to do it, right? The Republicans in these states don't want to do it while their Democratic governors do. So that's what I would say, I think, to that kind of person who is sort of not enamored with our strategy, right? And that's fine. You don't have to be enamored with our strategy. All that we ask is that even if you aren't enamored with our strategy, and we hope we've convinced a number of you to be a little bit more excited about it, that you go ahead and you follow it anyway, quite frankly. That's what we're asking for. And that's all we can ask for, right? So I think that's probably a good place for us to end this inaugural episode of Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. So for those of you out there wondering whether you're going to vote in November, who you're going to vote for in November, remember to reject purity tests and embrace big tent politics. There we go. Brought it back home.
Good job.
All right. Well, until next time, I'm Clayton Becker.
And I'm Megan Cox.
And we will see you next time.